SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
And we continue to take you through this historic moment, South Africa hosting the first G20 Leaders Summit, and that's well underway in terms of the plenary session between the leaders. There was that moment, and in fact I think it's still ongoing, Sharon, where the various leaders of the various countries and country groupings are making statements on this declaration that has now been adopted, at least at the level of the Sherpas, and it's been endorsed. And there was a great deal, as Minister Ronald Lamula was telling us, great deal of engagement with the leaders themselves in terms of endorsing the text that came through from the Sherpas.
And it also takes a little bit of the suspense away, right? We would have now been anticipating and talking about an outcome document. Initially, we were framing this as 80% done and 20% that was going to be handed over like a football to the leaders.
Yeah.
And then that little surprising moment where we found out that the adoption was imminent, and then finding out soon after that there was an adoption by consensus. We are getting some information about what is contained in this outcome document. We understand it's a voluminous document, about 100 plus paragraphs. Some of the headlines: strengthening disaster resilience and response, taking action to ensure debt sustainability, like we were talking about for low-income countries in particular, mobilizing finance for a just energy transition, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. The details there very, very important. Inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment and reduced inequality, food security, AI, data governance and innovation for sustainable development, partnership for Africa, the finance track, the list goes on. While all of that is being discussed, there are also protests outside.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are the workings of South Africa's democracy, the robustness of the democracy, because we do not suspend our democracy even as we are on the international stage. So we will be showing our viewers, there you have it, just some of the visuals of the protests that are taking place outside. Griselda Lewis watching all of that, bringing that live coverage as only Griselda Lewis can, really. You saw earlier on when tear gas was being discharged, and there you will see now the police nyalas also deployed all around the precinct of the Nasrec Expo Center. And much of the complaint from those who are picketing outside was that they would have wanted to be even closer to the venue, but that is simply not going to happen given the levels of security that we are dealing with for this Leaders Summit. We do want to bring in Elizabeth Sideropoulos into the conversation in a moment, Sharon, but not before you and I take a step back from all the serious stuff.
Yes.
Okay? And acknowledge that we got something wrong, you and I, okay? You and I want to attribute it to you, so you are going to take responsibility. When we saw the first glimpse of the room inside there was that structure that was curious at the top, ceiling level.
Yes.
And I was asking, what's that? It looks interesting. And we wagered and basically risked and hazarded a guess that it looks like spaceship features.
I'm sticking with spaceship.
No, it's the South African national plant, the Protea, representing the resilience of South Africa, just the regeneration as well, and really thriving despite the odds. So they've positioned it nicely such that it's just almost like a dome.
Your sentimentality is appreciated, but when you put a Protea on a ceiling, it could look like the Star Trek Enterprise. So,
I hear you.
We are going to have to agree to disagree. Shall we go to our guest?
Let's go to Elizabeth Sideropoulos. Thank you so much for coming through, Elizabeth.
Probably is a Protea, actually.
Probably.
And somehow it seems we've rocketed.
So now there's no Captain Kirk in the room
No
anymore.
Captain
You're just
Kirk.
Diluting everything we discussed.
But somehow we managed to rocket to a declaration, it seems.
Right.
Elizabeth,
Warp speed.
Warp speed indeed. Elizabeth, just watching that opening session, there was that moment when President Ramaphosa, right at the end of his opening speech, then makes the declaration that the declaration has been adopted by overwhelming consensus. That's extraordinary, is it not, at summits such as these ones? Normally you have, it presented by the Sherpa and others to say, here's what we've worked on, we are largely in agreement. Can you as leaders endorse it such that it becomes the summit declaration?
So, of course, over the last 5 days, the Sherpas have been working very hard at ensuring that the people in the room were able to agree to a document. And I think by Friday morning, when we heard that the Sherpa meeting was done and dusted, I think everybody was comfortable with that document. And that, of course, went back to capitals. And in fact, even during the course of the Sherpa meetings, there was back and forth with capitals on particular language and so on and so forth. And so the document is the document that, you know, all the leaders who were in the room are comfortable with and happy with reflecting. Both all the work that has been done during the course of the year, because a lot of it is also summarizing some of the outcome documents or ministerial declarations, whether it's on climate or disaster risk resilience or on the critical minerals framework or food security, etc. And then there are obviously geopolitical paragraphs at the beginning. Right. And again, there the Sherpas worked really hard over the course of the last 5 days, often in parallel with the discussions that were happening on the rest of the document, to arrive at language that everybody was comfortable with in terms of how the global geopolitical, financial and economic situation is depicted. And I think there was generally a conviction that it was important to get an outcome to show the continued relevance and importance of multilateralism.
So an outcome at any cost, is that what you're saying? I mean, essentially when these negotiations ensue, you tend to get watered down language. So I wonder what the compromises look like and whether this is as robust as you might have hoped.
As you know from the UN.
I speak from experience.
Need I say any more?
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, when you try to adopt something by consensus and you have a variety of countries in the room who have different social, political, economic contexts and so on, you've got countries that, are fossil fuel exporters, you have countries that have lots of critical minerals, you have countries that are committed, that adopt a gender equality approach, and others who are not, some people who feel comfortable with the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals and others who do not. But the challenge and the beauty of some of these, if I can use that word, of these negotiations is that we all try to appreciate where each one of us comes from. Yeah. And I think there was a real sense of that in the room, that, okay, we understand where you're coming from. This is very important for South Africa if we're talking about women and girls empowerment. It's also very important for many other countries in the room. Okay, how can we achieve a sort of a language that reflects that we can all
balances the interests.
Exactly. So yes, is there watering down? Of course. If the document was entirely up to South Africa to draft, there might have been some stronger language on particular issues. But that's never what happens with these consensus documents.
How helpful is it in the process that the leaders themselves are now here? I hear you referring to, there was a lot of referring back to capitals, even in the Sherpas meetings. But now that the leaders are here, do you imagine, as I do, and in fact we don't need to imagine, because Minister Ronald Lamola told us that there was a fair amount of further diplomacy at head of state to head of state, head of state to head of government level, President Ramaphosa working his diplomatic skills, especially yesterday. Yeah,
well, that's exactly the point, because the Sherpas, after all, at the end of the day, can come up with a document, but it has to be signed off by the leaders. And from the South African perspective, you need the president to engage with his peers to make sure that there isn't anything that might be brought up in the plenary that could create some delays or some challenges or require some of the text to be reworked. We saw that, for example, with the Indonesian G20 presidency in 2022 relating to the war in Ukraine. Yeah. And that was touch and go in terms of whether we would be able to get a declaration or not.
Sorry, Sherwin, if I can jump in again. Without wanting to center the United States in this conversation, because clearly all these leaders are seeking to steer clear of that, but it does send an emphatic message if right at the start you are told we've adopted a declaration by overwhelming consensus without mentioning you, but also then in the same message you have an emphasis that says it was important for us to preserve the dignity of the G20. It still does send a clear message.
Yes, absolutely. And one should never underestimate the importance of symbolism and that kind of messaging. Because at the end of the day, you could still have a situation where the leaders sort of come together and then they think about their particular geopolitical security interests and say, well, maybe we need to tread carefully here. We may need to come up with a different way of presenting this document and so on, because we also have to recognize, we know there are very real national interests that these countries have, particularly in the security realm. The US is the incoming president next year, and I think those dynamics also feature in the minds of the other G20 countries. But I think what the message clearly is today is that leaders believe that informal groupings such as the G20 need to be sustained, need to exist, and therefore need to be seen to be effective and to be able to come to a decision, even if it's some watered down issues, to show that international cooperation can work. And even though we have different domestic contexts, social, economic, etc., we can still identify areas where we can work together in the global sphere and in the regional sphere.
Let me ask you a final question before we take you to take this conversation to break. We have a declaration now. The heavy lifting has been done by the Sherpas. The diplomacy has worked. And now we have to implement it. And we need to find the means of implementation. And often in a scenario like that, the political will becomes lacking. You were already talking about maybe there'll be some backtracking. What does the road ahead really look like? Because now the rubber needs to hit the road. This is really important stuff: food security, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and the beneficiation and supply chains that surround that. This needs to happen. How do we ensure that it does?
So that's one of the big challenges that the G20 has faced. It works well during crisis, maybe works less well when there isn't an imminent
But it is
crisis.
a crisis if you really think about it, right?
Yes.
Climate is a crisis.
Climate is a crisis.
Poverty is a crisis.
But I think the way in which countries sometimes view crises is if it's right at the door.
Right.
And
COVID.
I think that's the challenge. And it's one of the issues that came up in the G20 at 20 review, that in fact on a lot of issues, particularly in the Sherpa track, perhaps because also the agenda has become too broad, the ability to implement or the political commitment to implement has sometimes been a little watery and a little shaky. And I'm being diplomatic. Yeah. Some of the things some of the issues in the document are issues that individual countries can take on. For example, there are a lot of ideas there around what is important for Africa to be doing and to be leveraging some of the development finance, etc., how to deal with debt, particularly through the Borrowers Club. There are issues we can take forward as Africa. There are other things that we need to work together across so-called divides to drive change or reforms internally within the World Bank or the IMF. And some of these are already on the table and actually being driven forward.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you
Elizabeth Sideropoulos. She was part of the T20, Think 20, that also participated in some of the work leading up to where we are. On the other side of the break, we'll be in conversation with the Deputy Minister of Finance, Dr. David Masondo, who will come through and we'll take him through the finance track and some of the provisions that we believe are part of the G20 Leaders Declaration. That and more still to come.